When Mother's Day means celebrating your mom, your wife, maybe even your daughter as a new mom, trust 1-800-Flowers to help you celebrate every important woman in your life. With double blooms from 1-800-Flowers, order 1 dozen roses and get another dozen for free. It's a simple way to give beautifully, with colorful blooms that make Mother's Day feel meaningful. For every mom you're celebrating, order with confidence and get double blooms at 1-800-Flowers.com/podcast. That's 1-800-Flowers.com/podcast.
Breaking news for your home. Way Day. Wayfair's big sale is almost here, and you can score the best deals in home. Like up to 80% off everything home. Yes, you heard that right. 80% off with free shipping on everything. Plus surprise flash deals all Way Day long. We're talking outdoor furniture and essentials, rugs, and more. All at Wayfair, and all up to 80% off during Way Day. Shop Wayfair's Way Day from April 25th through 27th.
Wayfair, every style, every home.
History as it happens, May 23rd, 2025. What is Chinese communism?
Xi has ordered the People's Liberation Army to be ready to take Taiwan by force by 2027.
Nearly 1 in every 3 physical products made in the world today comes from China, including most of what we use in our daily lives.
Conflict in the Western Pacific over the Taiwan question would result in a 25% GDP contraction in Asia.
In this new era of strategic competition, what does China under Xi Jinping want? Can China, whose ruling Communist Party counts 100 million members, still be called a communist country with its economy so deeply integrated into global capitalism? Understanding ideas, ideology, motivations is critical. That's next as we report history as it happens. I'm Martin DeCaro.
As I have pointed out on a number of occasions over the past 3 years, there can be no stable and enduring peace without the participation of the People's Republic of China and its 750 million people.
I want to see us stay involved and continue to work for restraint and for human rights and for democracy.
Our products will gain better access to China's market in every sector, from agriculture to telecommunications to automobiles.
Look, for years we've been ripped off and taken advantage of by China and others, in all fairness, but by China, that's the big one.
There's a simple answer to this question and a more complicated answer to this question. If you just ask, what does it mean to be Chinese communist today, the simplest answer to this is to say it is to be a member of the Chinese Communist Party. There is something called the Chinese Communist Party. You can become a candidate member of the Chinese Communist Party. You can become a member of the Chinese Communist Party, which imposes a set of rules. There's a party charter all the party members have to effectively sign on to. So you become a part of a massive organization. That's what it means to be Chinese Communist. Now, not every Chinese citizen is a member of the Chinese Communist Party, but Chinese leaders certainly are.
If you caught some recent congressional hearings, you would have been left with the impression that U.S. leaders are convinced Communist China will invade Taiwan, and a war would result in a global economic meltdown.
This hearing today is not just another discussion about long-term competition with China. This is about a very real, near-term threat and the narrowing window we have to prevent a catastrophic conflict in the Indo-Pacific.
And the famed investor Ken Griffin put it more bluntly, it's an immediate Great Depression. So why is it that Taiwan is different? Why is Taiwan such a hot flashpoint? Why could it lead not only to a catastrophic war, but also global Great Depression? Why should Americans care about an island on the other side of the world?
Senator Cotton, that last point is quite salient. Many a research organization postulate that conflict in the Western Pacific over the Taiwan question would result in a 25% GDP contraction in Asia and a knock-on effect of 10 to 12% GDP reduction in the United States of America, with unemployment spiking 7 to 10 points above base.
In the words of Republican Congressman Mike Gallagher, the greatest threat to the United States is the Chinese Communist Party. The CCP, he says, continues to commit genocide, obscure the origins of the coronavirus pandemic, steal hundreds of billions of dollars worth of American intellectual property, and threaten Taiwan. Well, it's hard to argue with much of what he said there, except for that first sentence maybe. Is the Chinese Communist Party really the greatest threat to the United States? Does it matter that China's capitalist economy can't do without American consumers? Really, it's President Trump's tariffs that threaten China by upending the global trading system. China is the world's top exporter. On the other hand, as Princeton's Kyle Chan writes in the New York Times, as Trump takes a wrecking ball to the pillars of U.S. power and innovation, China already leads global production in multiple industries: steel, aluminum, shipbuilding, batteries, solar power, electric vehicles, wind turbines, drones, 5G equipment, consumer electronics, active pharmaceutical ingredients, and bullet trains. China, he says, is projected to account for 45%, nearly half, of global manufacturing by 2030. Beijing is also laser-focused, he says, on winning the future. In March, it announced a $138 billion national venture capital fund that'll make long-term investments in cutting-edge technologies such as quantum computing and robotics, and increased its budget for public research and development. Again, that is Kyle Chan in an op-ed for the New York Times. But none of that sounds very communist or Marxist, at least not the Marxism I remember from the Soviet Union. So what does it mean to be a Chinese communist today? The party at the top is central to Xi Jinping's thinking. Actually, there is something called Xi Jinping thought on socialism with Chinese characteristics for a new era. It was formally incorporated into the party constitution in 2017, and anyone interested can read transcripts of his speeches translated to English online. There can be no greater authority on Chinese communism than the top Chinese communist himself, right?
上个世纪60年代末，我还不到16岁，就从北京来到了陕西省北部的一个小村庄当农民，一干就是7年。
Beamed to you straight from Chinese state television.
我去接景平和其他知青来我不错。
At a so-called CCP study session last autumn, Xi stressed the need to anchor the strategic goal of becoming a cultural superpower by 2035, uphold Marxism as the fundamental guiding ideology, take China's profound and rich civilization as the root, respond to trends in information technology, and continuously develop socialist culture with Chinese characteristics for a new era. A culture with ideological leadership, spiritual cohesion, values-based appeal, and international influence, constantly reinforcing the people's spiritual strength and firmly building a cultural foundation for superpower construction and national rejuvenation. My goodness, what does that mean? Sergey Radchenko is a historian at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, an expert on Russian and Chinese foreign and security policies, and the author of To Run the World, a provocative study of the Cold War. Enrico Maria Fardella is a historian at Johns Hopkins SAIS Europe, an expert on Chinese foreign policy, and the director of ChinaMed.it. Again, that is ChinaMed.it. It looks at China's role in the Mediterranean. Sergey Radchenko, welcome back to the show.
Martin, great to be back.
You're always globetrotting. You're in the United Kingdom today, huh?
I'm in the United Kingdom, which is, well, part of where I spend my year anyway. I'm here quite a lot.
Strangely sunny there today, and our other guest is somewhere where I would like to be all the time. Enrico Fardella, this is your first time on the show. Welcome, joining us from Italy.
Thank you so much for having me, Martin.
So nowadays, every day, you hear things like China says, China wants, China is this, China is that. The title of this episode is, What is Chinese Communism Today? You know, many years ago, I had a class at Ithaca College called Ideas and Ideologies. And I'm always thinking about ideas and ideologies, especially after reading Sergey's book last year on what drove Soviet foreign policy. Was it realism? Was it ideology? Why don't we just start broadly then, Enrico? What do we mean by China today? I know it's a sprawling and huge question, but what does it mean to be a Chinese communist in 2025?
I think being a Chinese communist has always been, first and foremost, being Chinese nationalists that use communism, actually socialism, as an instrument, to achieve nationalistic goals. The nationalist element, I think, is absolutely fundamental when it comes to Chinese communism.
This has real-world implications, Sergey. We have to understand motivations, right? Understanding motivations is critical. So as in the United States today, we hear the Trump administration wants to prioritize the conflict or confrontation or competition with China. Well, what is China after, right? What does it mean to be a Chinese communist in 2025?
There's a simple answer to this question and a more complicated answer to this question. If you just ask, what does it mean to be Chinese communist today? The simplest answer to this is to say it is to be a member of the Chinese Communist Party. There is something called the Chinese Communist Party. You can become a candidate member of the Chinese Communist Party. You can become a member of the Chinese Communist Party, which imposes a set of rules. There's a party charter all the party members have to effectively sign on to. So you become a part of a massive organization. That's what it means to be Chinese communist. Now, not every Chinese citizen is a member of the Chinese Communist Party, but Chinese leaders certainly are. And in fact, in China, you have a sort of a parallel organization. You have the state council, you have ministries, and then you have the party that is supposed to guide the actions of those ministries. And of course, then you have President Xi Jinping, Chairman Xi Jinping. We call him president. In Chinese, it's just 主席, right? He's a national chairman, Xi Jinping. Yes. He's also general secretary of the Chinese Communist Party. So he's got those hats. In addition, he's got some other hats as well. But this is what it organizationally means to be a Chinese communist.
Yeah, it's a giant pyramid with 100 million members. 100 million Chinese roughly are members of the Communist Party, with the Politburo and Xi Jinping at the very top, right?
And the standing committee of the Politburo, it is very, very hierarchically structured, right? So Xi Jinping then comes out at the very, very top. But that is organizationally. Then if you try to answer it more broadly, philosophically, fundamentally, what does it mean to be a Chinese communist? And I think I would have to agree with Enrico, because we are talking about a worldview, first and foremost, a worldview, and it may incorporate certain insights from Das Kapital, from Marxism, Leninism, maybe something from Maoism as well, but there's also very strong dose of Chinese nationalism. If we're talking about a worldview as opposed to an ideology, then I can tell you that it's a very complicated worldview that has all kinds of influences that feed then into the thinking about the world that the Chinese leaders have. But yes, China at the center, Chinese nationalism, I think that's probably even more important than anything that has to do with communism in the way that, let's say, Lenin would have thought about it, or Marx would have thought about it.
We can find sort of ingredients of like different form of socialism. For example, I would say that being Chinese communist today, or being the member of the Chinese Communist Party today, means to be much more trained in Leninism than used to be in the past, for example. I mean, I would say that Xi Jinping today, but we can go back on this, is much more Leninist in terms of puts like much more emphasis on organizational principles, on the structure of the party. The ideology is functional to strengthen and enhance the solidity of the party. So in this regard, I would say that today the Chinese Communist Party is more Leninist. But I think that, what we have to keep in mind when it comes to China, and also when we tend to somehow emphasize Chinese capacity to synthesize, different thoughts, different methods, is the fact that the main goal that defined the Chinese communism is actually the China dream. You can actually apply different categories, you can apply different methods, you can call them, socialists with Chinese characteristics, as long as they are functional to achieve this goal. So I think that the national horizon is the most important perspective to define, being a Chinese communist today. So paradoxically, you can be a Chinese communist today without being communist.
Well, Xi Jinping wants to make China a great power, and he rests very heavily on history and interpretation of history. Mao Zedong seems to be important to him as well, despite all of the horrors that occurred under Mao's rule. So, Enrico, I'll just ask you a follow-up question. I mean, how important is class struggle, which is so central to communist ideology, in China today? I'll give you an example. From Time magazine, on January 1st, the official ideological journal of the CCP, Quishi, published a speech by Xi. Xi called for a period of protracted struggle to maintain political security, achieve self-reliance, and demonstrate the superiority of Chinese-style modernization. He said history has repeatedly proven that striving for security through struggle brings genuine security, while seeking security through weakness and concession ultimately leads to insecurity. I guess my first question is, why do Chinese people have to keep struggling?
Actually, this article, the speech, was originally delivered by Xi Jinping in 2023, and it was published this January. And this is meaningful because, we have to contextualize the notion of struggle. Struggle is functional for Xi Jinping in order to enhance solidity within the party, so domestically. So it's a call for, alignment and a call for order, following the order coming from the top. The absolute faith in the leader creates order and harmony within the country in a moment when China feels, or at least describe itself as being contained, circumvented under the pressure of what is called American hegemonism. You see, in Xi Jinping version, basically there is a sort of a new and I would say very functional way to create a sort of like overlapping between the thought of the leader and the identity of Chinese people, in the sense that you can't be Chinese if you don't recognize yourself into Xi Jinping thought. This is kind of unprecedented in the sense that leader thought provides you with identity and mission. So fighting inside the country means following leader's thought, and at the same time, this allows China to, move up, in the ladder at international level.
Xi Jinping thought. That's something. Yeah. Sergey, why don't you tell us about that a little more?
Well, Xi Jinping is only the latest and among Chinese leaders who wants to have some theoretical work to have him remembered by, a collection of Xi Jinping speeches that is diligently produced. It's actually also available in English. It's Xi Jinping on governance. You can get it. You can pick these things up from the Chinese embassy, where you have this long speeches by Xi Jinping describing different policies, talking about international affairs, talking about economic policies, et cetera, et cetera. So things like that, which can be distilled, and you can say, well, here's what Xi Jinping stands for, in the sort of way that you could previously talk about, for example, what Deng Xiaoping stood for, or perhaps what Mao Zedong stood for. Of course, we had something called Mao Zedong thought, right? Mm-hmm. There's a certain degree of continuity here in this effort, but I would not go too deeply into this for the following reason. I mean, I know there's some China scholars as well who take it extremely seriously. I'm thinking of people like Kevin Rudd, for example, who really study this deeply. And I understand the need to read the speeches and to go through them with a magnifying glass and say, well, what does Xi Jinping's view on the correlation of forces in, economic production tell us about his view on socialism? I think that is sometimes counterproductive, actually. You can sometimes step back from terms that are being used and get to the bottom of what actually is the meaning of some of these concepts. I mean, consider, I'll give you just a couple of examples. Sure. You mentioned class struggle. Is that a Marxist notion? Is it a Maoist? Certainly a Maoist notion, right? Mao had that, a concept of struggle. Mao also had notions like, political power comes out of a barrel of a gun, perhaps his most famous statement. Is that an ideological pronouncement? To a certain extent, you can argue that. Or you can also say that this is just basically an expression of realism, and you can apply it to other contexts and other cultures, and it has always been like that. I mean, if you go back to Thucydides, you'll find in the Million dialogue something like, the weak suffer what they must and the strong exact what they can, right? This kind of argument, Mao had the same sort of approach to his own philosophical pronouncements, etc. So you have a lot of continuities, and making this exceptionalist argument about this, well, this Chinese communist ideology just means this particular set of things. I think, to me, it's just not particularly constructive way of understanding what's going on in China.
Well, the Soviet Union was founded on Marxism, right? Marxism-Leninism, stage theory. You move from capitalism to socialism to then this utopia. You reach communism. But at some point, relatively early in the game, I think domestically, the Soviet leaders gave up on that. They knew they were not going to reach that utopia. And of course, they stopped trying to, if you agree with the thesis of Sergey's book, they weren't trying to export communism really either. I mean, is China today, Sergey, trying to export communism? I mean, what is the Chinese world order?
Well, and this is precisely what I'm trying to say here, Martin. Take the Soviet example as an interesting case study. You had a formal ideology of Marxism-Leninism, and also you had a kind of a formal, what you just described, right, procession of history from a more primitive stage to a more advanced stage to, the socialism stage to advanced socialism to communism, at which point, according to Marx, the state is supposed to wither away and we all live happily thereafter. Did the Soviet leaders actually believe this story? I don't know who actually did, frankly. Maybe Khrushchev, he was a revolutionary romantic. Maybe at some point he actually believed that. We get into the 60s and 70s. Does anybody actually believe in the Soviet Union that there's going to be some kind of a communist society, egalitarian, wonderful society that's going to be constructed? There's nothing like that, right? Yeah. You turn to China, you also have that period in China of this romantic engagement with the ideas of building some kind of a new society. Think about the late 1950s and the Great Leap Forward and the reordering of society, the construction of communes, Mao's ideas surrounding the Cultural Revolution, and so on and so forth. And then you have Chinese leaders backtracking from this, including actually Mao himself, because he realized that Cultural Revolution wasn't going anywhere and that there were economic laws that you simply could not violate. And so you have Deng Xiaoping, who then basically took China in the direction of what I would describe as capitalism, frankly, capitalism, not any kind of, socialism with Chinese characteristic. You can name it what you want, but it's very capitalistic at its very core. It's very different from what China was in the 1950s and the 1960s. In other words, the structure, the formal ideology remains, presumably those ideas that were guiding China in the 1950s, at some level, something remains. But in reality, are we moving towards a new socialist utopia in China? It's not happening.
Well, at the same time, though, Enrico, to build off of Sergey's argument, I'd like to hear what you have to say. She has emphasized the importance of the party itself.
Yeah, so I have 2 points here that are connected to the last questions. First is continuity and discontinuity. Continuity is true that, of course, she is looking back to Mao. The point of looking back to Mao and recreate a sort of continuity in the party history and methodology, and the war struggle actually perfectly emphasized that, is the fact that, Xi Jinping was afraid of actually the discontinuity generated by the narrative that Deng Xiaoping was the good Chinese leader and Mao Zedong was the bad Chinese leader, right? And so this narrative was dysfunctional, for the party narrative, and somehow, was presenting a China that was more lenient towards the West as a good option for party future, and for the future of the country. Where Xi Jinping was actually re-emphasizing autarky, was re-emphasizing the centrality of China and the need, to achieve greatness without the West. So the continuity and going back to Mao is very important. But there is a very important discontinuity in this. Mao was emphasizing permanent struggle, permanent revolution, and this generated the Cultural Revolution and, and the pain that even Xi Jinping family had to go through. So, and this actually, Mao's permanent struggle was putting the structure of the Chinese Communist Party in danger. During the Cultural Revolution, China was close to anarchy, civil war. And so for Xi Jinping, it's very important to enhance the Leninist component. So the party first, the order and the survival of the party is fundamental to achieve the China dream. Xi Jinping is somehow re-enhancing Maoist categories in a very interconnected world. And so globalization somehow generates like a sort of overextension of the security dimension within China. Anti-China forces in Europe, as much as in the US or even in Latin America, they are a potential threat for regime stability. And so therefore, it's important to generate a system of governance that somehow expand the order that Xi Jinping is trying to create domestically abroad.
So let's talk about what China is doing abroad then in this context, because it's not trying to turn other countries communist. The Belt and Road Initiative wasn't about trying to make other countries communist. Taiwan, maybe Taiwan's in a different category. That would probably fall under the domination of the Chinese Communist Party if there were a war there or whatever. But just generally speaking, Enrico, what is China trying to export, if anything?
China has never tried, even during Mao's time, the mission of Chinese Communist Party has never been to turn the world into a communist world. China has always tried to enhance independence externally. So if you want to basically describe simply Chinese foreign policy, there is one word, is anti-hegemonic, okay? So in 1950s and 60s, as much as today, to a certain extent, China has always found like a much more powerful actor than the United States, and in some cases even the Soviet Union. And so what China can do politically is not to export communism, which is not functional, but actually to enhance independence. The more independence you have in the planet, the less space for American hegemony. So this is key. The strengthening independence is inversely proportional to the space that American hegemony can have worldwide. And so this is functional as sort of proactive defense for China. That's why since the beginning, I emphasized the importance of Chinese nationalism. Mao Zedong was talking about the intermediate zone, those areas, Europe, Africa, Latin America, that were standing in between the United States, so the hegemon, and the socialist bloc. This is the area where China, and until today, you can see with the Belt and Road Initiative, with the initiatives towards the global south, the BRICS and so forth and so on. This is the area where China is the pole that China wants to dominate. And wants to dominate this pole not by expanding communism, by enhancing independence. And how you enhance independence, guess what? By learning from the China model. Because China has been raising as an independent power, so we have the software that can allow you to be independent and not to fall in the trap of American hegemony.
Just maybe one or a couple of points to add to this. And I would generally agree with Enrico. I would say there's one particular moment where the Chinese did show great messianic zeal about promoting a particular vision of the world, and this was during the Cultural Revolution. It was very actually ironic because at that time they withdrew ambassadors that they had abroad from all countries except for Egypt. And Enrico knows this. The story, Huang Hua stayed in Egypt for unclear reasons. We still don't know why, but they withdrew all ambassadors. But at the same time, they had the revolutionary struggle unfold at Chinese embassies around the world. And in some countries, that really annoyed the local authorities. This is one of the reasons why Chinese relations with North Korea really worsened in the late 1960s because of the Cultural Revolution, because the Chinese were trying to export the Cultural Revolution. Same in Vietnam. Nobody wanted that. And after that, they recognized the error of their ways. And they're like, we're not doing this any longer. And so the Chinese have become very, very pragmatic. And when you asked Martin, are they trying to export, why they're not exporting communism? Well, one of the reasons for that is, frankly, I don't think they're communists themselves. Why would they export communism when they're not a communist country themselves? Now, you might say, well, isn't there a model? We're talking about Leninist principles of state organization. And, that's a particular model that you could potentially export. And yes, Enrico is exactly right. They're not exporting that particular model, whether you call it communism or something else, I don't know. We're just coming back to this. What is communism fundamentally, right? We need to try to figure this out. Is it about the way you organize your economy? Is that about the way you organize your society? Is, for example, the fact that 60% of Chinese economy is private owned, is that, what is that?
That's not communism.
I mean, you can call it socialism with Chinese characteristics or whatever you call it. It doesn't actually matter. It's basically capitalism, right? It doesn't make any sense.
Well, Sergey, let me ask a follow-up to something that Enrico said. And Enrico, you can chime in as well. This idea of Chinese-style modernization and an alternative model to the U.S. hegemonic model in the eyes of Beijing, right? So they're offering these other countries independence. But a criticism of the Belt and Road Initiative is these other countries in the global south that accept Chinese investment aren't actually becoming independent of American hegemony. They're falling under Chinese hegemony.
From a Chinese perspective, this makes sense. It's good. It's a much more sophisticated and civilized way to exercise power. It's not whether a foreign country is trapped into a specific hegemony. What matters is that hegemony is not defined by a foreign actor. A foreign actor is antagonistic for China. I don't think that China actually consciously, or any Chinese scholar consciously think that China is going to turn into an hegemonic force. Honestly, I think they are genuine, they are sincere, describing this kind of growing foreign influence within the framework of the Belt and Road as a sort of opportunity, for the other countries, because China is bringing a more stable, alternative, harmonious. There is not blatant, self-confidence, hegemonic attempt to shape the planet. You know what I mean?
And they don't make any demands about human rights.
Exactly. But it's also very important for party stability, because the less space there will be for the Washington consensus, for the liberal order, and liberal values, the stronger will be the resilience of the party. One level is proactive defense, okay? I try to push away, by enhancing independence, I basically impede American hegemony and, liberal values to become like a threat, getting closer and closer to China. This is the proactive defense measure. Then there is another level, which is ideological, in the sense that I am promoting my values because I genuinely believe that these values are better than the liberal ones, and they allow these countries to generate more proactive processes of economic development, regime stability, and so forth and so on.
Sergey, what did you make of Xi Jinping's trip to Moscow to celebrate Soviet Victory Day, May 9th?
It's not surprising to see Xi Jinping in Moscow. He has been traveling there, and he's been there quite a few times, even as Russia continues its war in Ukraine. And of course, Putin has already promised to come back to China for the end of the Pacific War celebrations in September. So we have had this exchange between Xi Jinping and Putin, which makes people say that these two regimes are increasingly allied. I would not use that word. I would say aligned is probably better. But the question is we're talking about ideologies today in communism, etc. Here's an interesting example. You would never think that Putin's Russia is communist in any kind of sense, right? I mean, it's not communist. It's basically an authoritarian regime. When we're talking about an ideological alignment with Xi Jinping, what exactly are we talking about here? Are the Chinese finding that their ideology is somehow overlapping with Putin's ideology? But in this case, what is this ideology that is overlapping?
It's described generally as autocracy. There are a couple of autocrats who want to dominate.
There are other autocrats around the world. I mean, look at Saudi Arabia. What, is MBS not an autocrat? He's an autocrat. So does that mean that MBS is ideologically aligned with China or something like that? We don't talk about that in those terms. When we operate with terms like ideology, we quickly get mired in this completely impenetrable swamp from which we then cannot escape. And then, we make these cases about, they're ideologically aligned, but at the same time, China is a communist country, but Putin's is not a communist country. How does it even square? Yeah. None of this actually works. The only argument you can say is that parts of their visions of the world overlap. And what Enrico was talking about, this anti-hegemonic discourse and really anti-American discourse, is where you can see some
anti-liberal.
Anti-liberal.
Anti-liberal, but I think if we drill into this, we basically find that it basically means anti-American.
So let me ask you this then, because I just talked to Anthony Beaver about this on my most recent episode. There is a notion out there that we have, if not a bloc, a group of autocrats who are challenging the post-1945 liberal world order, a reversion to might makes right. So, of course, Putin and Xi are not ideologically allied or aligned, but they both have an idea of we're going to dominate our own sphere of influence. So that's why you see them in public together and why Xi is kind of endorsing Russia's war in Ukraine. He's certainly not putting pressure on Putin to stop the war in Ukraine. So Putin has his sphere of influence in Eastern Europe, and China wants its sphere of influence in East Asia, Taiwan, the South China Sea, etc. What do you make of that framing?
First of all, I think that when we talk about the post-1945 order, I don't know what we're talking about here, because post-1945 order is the Cold War order, which had the world divided into blocks and spheres of influence. So nothing is being undermined. We're actually returning to the post-1945 order. So when I see, and a lot of people talk about that, I find it really interesting, because if we really drill into this, we'll see that it actually doesn't make any sense. The idea that you could use force to protect your sphere of influence, is that new? I mean, that was the rule during the Cold War. So it was nothing unusual about it. Think about the Soviet invasions of Hungary in 1956 and Czechoslovakia in 1968. Is that not using force to protect your sphere? Where? In Europe. Oh my God, in Europe, which had never seen anything like that since the Second World War, according to a lot of people who make this argument. No, this has long been the rule and the standard. So what we're really talking about here is a period from, let's say, the end of the Cold War to, I guess, now, when we actually forgot what the post-1945 order was about, and we thought that it was something else entirely. And we got used to this idea that, we just basically have one liberal hegemon. Everybody is living happily thereafter, and China and Russia will find places for themselves in that hierarchy. And it turned out that they don't want to find places for themselves. They want to overturn the hierarchy, or at least they want to unseat the United States from the top of this hierarchy. So this is how we got where we are today. But it's not about overturning the post-1945 order, in my reading at least.
I think the biggest threat to the post-1945 order, whatever that means, is coming from the United States, actually, more than from this axis of evil. Of course, they are playing defense. They are trying to resist, or they can be very aggressive, but I don't think that they have the capacity actually to break this order, because this is an order that is based on the infrastructure created by the United States that generates and distributes goods and wealth all over the world. And actually, China is the first actor, much more than Iran, much more than Russia, to have an interest to continue to keep working within this order. It's actually the opposite. Actually, China is afraid that the US are withdrawing from this order, and then China is going to pay the price of it, which is actually the topic of the day, in my opinion.
Yeah, exactly, because China is the number one exporter in the world. Multinational corporations that are headquartered in the United States have all their plants in Southeast Asia and in China, thinking about Walmart and all these others, and they need to manufacture their cheap goods there for cheap labor in China and then send them back to the United States so I can go buy a T-shirt for $5 at Walmart. So, yeah, I think you're right about that, Enrico.
Especially when we talk about this kind of political regime, we need to pay more attention to what they actually do, not to what they say. Because, of course, what they say, it's actually very much part of this propaganda system. The discrepancy between, propaganda and reality, sounds like, very obvious, but when it comes to China, it's humongous, especially when it comes to the economy. An economist disappeared the last few hours simply because he dared to say that China is not growing 5%. Chinese GDP is not growing 5%, but maybe 2%, just to give you an idea how sensitive is this topic. Then if you look at what actually the relationship between, the so-called BRICS countries, like the antagonist countries, to the US hegemony, you see that actually the dollar is still there, is still dominant, is still functional. It's actually much more in their interest to preserve, this infrastructure than it is these days for the US to preserve it.
Yeah, so you're saying the Chinese government sent away an economist who said the wrong thing? That just happened?
Yeah, exactly, yes.
All right, so how about this idea? We can start wrapping up here. Miles Mei-Chun Yu, writing for the Hoover Org, said that the Chinese Communist Party's strategic duplicity, so China is basically fooling the world, is his argument, is shaped by the fusion of warring states-era realpolitik with Marxist dialectical thinking. Now, if anyone is wondering what the hell is warring states period thinking, Chinese leaders were taught the most effective approach to power was to use deception, exploit weaknesses, and form opportunistic alliances without regard for strict principles or ideological commitments.
So this is the case of essentializing of China. We have a tendency to do that in the West among certain people. They draw on Sun Tzu or something and say, oh, look, Sun Tzu said in The Art of War that you should do this and this and this and practice strategic deception. Okay, yes. It's not like we don't do that in the West, right? We share a lot of this concept, but you've got Machiavelli, you've got Sun Tzu, you've got Thucydides, you've got all these thinkers around the world that have contributed to this idea of realist foreign policy or realist conduct of affairs, this ideas about realism, about deception, how to conduct war, and so on and so forth. It's not specifically Chinese, and we shouldn't essentialize the Chinese here and say that they have some kind of specific qualities about themselves or they think about the world in a kind of way that nobody else can understand, right? And then when you bring Marxism, Leninism into it and say, well, there's some Marxist-Leninist dialectics in the way they approach the world, my counter-argument to that is show me one example where they approach the world from using something from Marxism, Leninism. Is it maybe the concept of struggle, that they want to struggle or something until victory? What, is that a Marxist concept? Let's not be simplistic here, right? These concepts, they go far beyond Marxism. Yeah. There's nothing specifically Marxist about this. I think when we analyze Chinese foreign policy and what they want to do in the world, first of all, I think going back to what Enrico said at the very start, we need to begin with this idea of Chinese nationalism and Chinese centrality. That is clearly important. It's not unique to China to struggle for or to build yourself up as this major power. The Russians have the same sense of great power exceptionalism. America has the same thing. So that Chinese nationalism, that is the first point to understand what the Chinese are doing, Chinese centrality. And then you can draw on any number of philosophies and then you can say, okay, this is why they're doing this. But that is because we all do the same thing, frankly.
Yeah, China wants to absorb Taiwan somehow, not because of the warring states period, but because it's always been a priority. I guess what Sergey is saying, Enrico, is that we're always trying to decode China. By the way, the warring states period was 475 to 221 BC. Anyway.
It's like, Martin, it's like trying to explain what America is doing with reference to the Peloponnesian Wars. That's exactly what we're doing.
Well, okay, let me jump in and and say a couple of things here. At the same time, as a Sicilian, I can tell you that actually our Greek roots still matter somehow in our culture. So there is a bit of both. Plus, Mao Chun is a very sophisticated analyst, and so I think his work is actually deserves a lot of praise. Let's keep 1 second on the side, the combination of, warring state tradition plus, Marxist-Leninism, okay? And let's focus on the word deceiving, okay? And let me tell you something that may sound a little bit pro-China, but at the same time, it's it's a little bit provocative. I don't think that China has tried to deceive anybody. China is trying to maximize, its national power and avoid this destructive conflict with the hegemon, with a stronger power. And so by so doing, China had to find a way to be compatible with the system. So it's totally rational for China, to present itself, as a benign power, benevolent power, and trying to avoid clashes with the United States. And actually, the rising power China has achieved this level thanks to the United States, which is something that the Chinese propaganda these days doesn't emphasize enough. And now the problem is that the hegemon realized, the power that China has achieved. And so the problem is that, the hegemon wants to restructure, the United States, they want to restructure relationship with China.
Let me just give Miles Mei-Chun Yu his due, and I'm certainly no expert here, so I don't really have the background to question his analysis. I did want to bounce it off of both of you. He said, in contentious issues like Taiwan or the South China Sea, the CCP's dual influences from warring states realpolitik and Marxist dialectics is particularly evident. Warring state strategies encourage the CCP to engage in strategic patience, presenting one narrative to the world while gradually advancing its objectives in ways that do not provoke immediate confrontation. For instance, China publicly asserts a desire for peaceful reunification with Taiwan, while building military capabilities and establishing economic dependencies that increase its leverage over the region. Sergey.
Okay, so what exactly here can be described as a Marxist-Leninist
I don't know.
legacy?
I don't know.
That implies that if Japan was in place of China, Japan would have invaded Taiwan a long time ago.
Enrico, my problem is we do that, right, in social sciences. We sort of apply terms and we try to explain phenomena. And then when you dig into it and you try to be concrete about it, you just can't see anything there. That's why I'm saying that, okay, so China is exercising strategic patience with Taiwan while building up its military strength. Is that something like no other country has ever done?
China is a one-child country, and so parents, they really care about their children's life. And so China is trying to implement a strategy that, A, doesn't want to clash, with superior force, the coalition of, Quad, United States, Japan, because it's going to be very damaging for Chinese course, and at the same time doesn't want casualties, because, Chinese parents, they only have one child. And so, and
Enrico, this is not something you draw on from, on Sun Tzu or from the war.
No, but I think it's very rational. That's
it's
what
rational.
I'm saying.
It's rational. That's what I'm saying. It's totally understandable.
Deceiving the adversary is not something that, belongs to Chinese tradition for sure, but I don't think that defines, China per se. I think that even Italy is deceiving the, European Commission somehow, and
Absolutely.
So it belongs to like a toolkit that of any state that wants to achieve, rational targets.
That's right. My last question, I said I would wrap up here because I need to tie it all together. Understanding motivations is critical to understanding, say, what China plans to do in a certain part of the world. Warring states, Marxist dialectics. Sergey, what are the most common misconceptions or dangerous misconceptions in Washington, in official Washington, about China?
So that's, that's difficult to pin down. We have this idea, for example, in Washington that China is determined to invade Taiwan in the very near future. Is that a misconception? It seems like a consensus kind of thinking. It seems to me like a kind of echo chamber almost type of thinking where everybody says that and therefore everybody believes that. Is there a lot of evidence for it? If you start deconstructing some of these narratives, you'll then soon realize that actually the reality is much more complicated and foggy, and therefore you cannot actually make any clear policy recommendations on the basis of the existing evidence, which puts policymakers and policy advisors in a difficult situation. If we are fundamentally uncertain about what China is going to do, what Xi Jinping's intentions are, what are we going to advise? What kind of policy are we going to call for? A more hawkish policy because we want to deter China, a more engaging policy because we want to build bridges to them? I think the default is always in the direction of hawkishness, because there's a fear that if you try to engage with the Chinese and then get burned, then you'll be blamed for that. And therefore, it's just so much safer to be hawkish and to say, okay, we have to deter, we have to contain. Is that a bad policy? I wouldn't argue that. I think that's probably the most sensible policy given where we are at the moment. And by the way, the same applies to China today. We're talking about, strategic thinking in China about the West. You have people in China who are saying, actually, we should engage with the West. And others say, well, if you engage with the West, you get burned. And so we have to contain and we have to deter. And it is that second category of people who ultimately win the debate, because it's always safer in the short term to deter and to contain. And so when you have two sides who are so keen to deter and to contain for obvious reasons, because they don't know about the other's intentions, and we cannot know the amount of discussion about Sun Tzu or about Marx and Lenin will help us figure out the other side's intentions. Then in the condition of that uncertainty, the safest thing is to deter and to contain. And as a result, what we end up in is a spiral of insecurity and a confrontation.
Exactly. That's what the hawks don't want to admit. By deterring or showing strength, right, all you do is simply push the other side to think, hey.
Martin, it's the safest thing. It's the safest thing to do. So I'm not blaming the hawks. Yeah. I'm just saying, there are hawks on both sides and they're both right.
Enrico, misconceptions about China.
Well, that's a classic, exaggeration in both ways, that is functional, instrumental for, interest groups like, enhancing China's power, China as a sort of like superpower, the overwhelming presence all over the place in Middle East, in Africa, in Latin America, in our houses, in our cell phones. And on the other side, like actually those who claim that actually Chinese economy is falling apart and, China is doomed to failure, this exaggeration, which is like of the narrative about China, I think this is like a big problem, which is actually mirrors what is happening in China. The fact that China consider, the West overall as an aggressive and adversarial interlocutor. And so the space for recognition that there are rational voices and that you can actually could be in China's interest actually to partner up with the West. When I say the West, I would say the US-led, grouping, because Europe, is a different story.
Our action in seeking a new relationship with the People's Republic of China will not be at the expense of our old friends. It is not directed against any other nation. We seek friendly relations with all nations. Any nation can be our friend without being any other nation's enemy. I have taken this action because of my profound conviction that all nations will gain from a reduction of tensions and a better relationship between the United States and the People's Republic of China. It is in this spirit that I will undertake what I deeply hope will become a journey for peace. Peace not just for our generation, but for future generations on this earth we share together.
On the next episode of History as It Happens, what do Carl Schmitt, Leo Strauss, the Claremont Institute, and Adrian Vermeule have in common? The ideas behind Trump 2.0? That's next with Damon Linker. New episodes every Tuesday and Friday. My newsletter every Friday. It is free. Sign up at historyasithappens.com.